coronavirus vaccine, which undoubtedly is a very important... Sorry, excuse me. I'm just getting some breaking news just coming through that clinical psychologists can indeed experience mental health issues. I'm going to take you over to our mental health correspondent, Sandra, for more information. Yes, thank you, Karen. Psychologists have indeed banded together to confirm they do experience things like anxiety and depression. Why we thought they were magical beings in the first place is still unclear, but I'll get back to you when I have further updates. Thank you, Sandra. Well, hello again. It's me, it's Miranda, and today's video is going to focus on lived experience amongst clinical psychologists. As many of you will know, the BPS recently published two very exciting documents talking about the value of lived experience amongst our profession. So these documents are going to form like the basis of today's discussion. I'm going to split the video into two halves. The first half just giving a bit of background, bit of context, laying out the foundations of those two documents, and then thinking about, with those findings and with those lessons learned presented in those two documents, how can we think about the different stages of becoming a clinical psychologist and the obstacles that still exist that we need to talk about to move things forward. So, with all of that covered, let's get straight into it. Okay, so starting off thinking about background. So let's start off with the concept of lived experience. So what is that? That's essentially just the experience of mental health difficulties. So it's not necessarily only people who have received a formal diagnosis or have received like structured medical or therapeutic support for said difficulty. It's actually a pretty inclusive term. So now thinking about lived experience amongst clinical psychologists. So for this, let's take it back to the studio.
Well, Dr. Natalie Kemp is a clinical psychologist, and in October 2017, she set up an online peer support group for mental health professionals who are actually also experiencing mental health issues themselves, proving, of course, Natalie, that no one's immune, are they?
No, absolutely not. When you go through really difficult times in life, various traumas, they don't discriminate by job title. And if you were to be able to read a number of books and do a set of training as a mental health professional in the sense or in the hope that that might make you immune to experiencing some mental health problems, then we would probably just train everybody as clinical psychologists. But it's not the case, and it wasn't the case for me. So it's been an amazing journey.
Thank you, Dr. Kemp. As she very rightly points out, just because we work in clinical psychology and have some grasp of mental health difficulties and what causes them, that doesn't in any which way give us this like impenetrable armor that means that we will never develop any difficulties or challenges ourselves. And actually, research has shown that the prevalence rate amongst clinical psychologists is actually pretty high in terms of individuals who identify as having lived experience. But why these documents and these discussions are so important is that actually among clinical psychologists there's quite a high level of perceived stigma that people don't feel comfortable in terms of like opening up and sharing their experiences as professionals. Either like that, or they have actually had really negative experiences when they have done so, and like both of those things really need to be addressed. So let's think about document number 1. So this is a position statement from the Division of Clinical Psychology, and it opens with this. The Division of Clinical Psychology publicly recognises and supports the unique and valued contribution that lived experience of mental health difficulties brings to individuals working within clinical psychology. So can we all just take a minute to just like reflect on how beautiful that first sentence is? Like, it literally feels like a public declaration of love and respect between the DCP and clinical psychologists with lived experience. It's literally like, and if you don't get that reference, then shame on you. But I think why it's so important, and I think why it resonated with me so much, is that this year has been pretty underwhelming and exceptionally disappointing in terms of organizations failing to be very clear about who they support and who they do not support. I don't know, for fear of being like political, I don't know, whatever. But there have been disappointments this year. So it's so refreshing and so lovely to have a document like that, which just makes itself very clear and very black and white. And I think what else I really like about this document is that it acknowledges that stigma exists, that challenges exist, that clinical psychologists have had pretty torrid experiences when opening up about their difficulties. It doesn't brush any of that under the carpet, but it's like bottom line is like,
you guys are valuable and we need you, and you bring so much to our profession.
So thinking about document 2 now, so this is essentially like a set of guidelines which set out how we can best support trainee clinical psychologists as they go through their training program. And I think this is so important because we already know that the prevalence of mental health difficulties in clinical psychologists is high. And I think part of that reason is that a lot of people are attracted to the profession because they've experienced things themselves. And I think it's also important to recognize that the course itself can be really emotionally demanding. I think not least because the content is intense sometimes, but also people often uproot and move across countries. Hello. So they're really far away from their usual support network. So I think it's so important to have quite clear guidelines and steps that we can take. And one of the things that I really liked within it is it has this whole section to how we can foster a community and an environment within training, which says it's okay to talk about your experiences, and not only that, we really value them here, which I think is so lovely. And it actually talks about lots of different examples from different universities of how they've started to embed some of those practices into their training program. So the document then goes on to talk about making things like confidentiality super, super clear. So also thinking about if you want to share your lived experience of mental health difficulties, having a bit of a framework to help you kind of in that decision-making process, which I think is awesome. And then thinking about if things do get really difficult, what happens if you need to take a little bit of time out or return to the profession and training a little bit later on. And I'm just giving such a high level view of both of these documents, but I would really encourage you to read both of them because I think they are so important, and I think such a valuable and critical first step forward. But I think as with every guideline, every policy, it is literally just the first step, and I think we need to keep thinking about the obstacles which do exist, having open conversations about that. So now we can have really practical and directed and focused conversations about how to make things easier and more accessible for people who do have lived experience in this profession. So with all of that considered, let's go on to section 2. So thinking about the pre-training phase, so when we're applying to the clinical psychology doctorate, now that we have all this information which just says mental health difficulties are super common amongst people who are aspiring clinical psychologists and beyond, what can we do with all of this in mind to make the application feel a little bit more mental health friendly? And I guess one of the things that is jumping out to my mind is just, which in fairness is not specific to the DClin application, it's everywhere in the job market, it's that little box basically asking you to explain yourself when you have any gaps in your employment. And that just pisses me off in itself, because we're going to be working
forever and ever and ever ad infinitum. So if we've taken 3 months off, why do we need to even explain ourselves? But
Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. My point is, in the DClin application, they just give this really hilarious example. So they invite you to explain yourself, and then they give an example of something that you might say to explain why you have a particular gap. And they say something like, time spent traveled in South America, which number one, is the most middle class example ever. But number two, I think if we're thinking that people might use that box to talk about having had to take time out for a personal reason, whether that be mental health issues or something else, it just seems like a real missed opportunity to use an example which is going to normalize talking about those kind of things, and actually just say, hey, it's kind of pretty expected and pretty common that you might have something like that. You're more than welcome to share. So I was thinking an example of time spent out due to a family bereavement or something like that, which I think just gives the message of like it's okay to talk about things which aren't sort of like random voyages across the globe. I think another thing which is on the form, which is very well summed up by my Twitter friend Matt, is that actually there's more space on the form to talk about like your hobbies and interests than there is to think about like any disadvantages you've overcome or like mitigating factors, personal circumstances which are needed to like provide context to your application. And again, I think if we're like thinking from the perspective that mental health difficulties and the experiences of that and like the disadvantages and challenges that those can bring about how valuable they are to our profession, maybe we could reflect that with like a little bit more space or a little bit more wiggle room in the application itself. Maybe? I think also something that I've like noticed a lot, say like on like DClinPsy forums, that there's always these conversations around like the application itself, but also on interviews in terms of like, what should I disclose and how much should I disclose and like what's appropriate versus what's inappropriate. And I hate the word inappropriate with respect to thinking about discussing and sharing mental health difficulties, because the word inappropriate, I feel like it just brings the image of like a naughty puppy peeing on some expensive furniture, and I just don't think that word should ever be associated with sharing something that's so meaningful and personal. I think it's more about like, how can you share those things safely and how can you do that in a way that makes you feel empowered? Those kind of discussions are way better. But I think ultimately it reflects a really, really very real fear, which definitely like I felt and I still feel, of like, if I share something, how are people, and more than that, how are like my superiors and people who are assessing my application, how are they going to think of me and how is that going to reflect on me? So I think it's like, it just shows maybe that there's like an additional step, a few additional steps that need to be taken, maybe at like the individual university level, which just says like, it's absolutely fine and it's very welcome if you want to discuss those things as part of your application or in your interviews, because that actually brings a very interesting dimension to your perspective as an individual and as an applicant. Okay, so now thinking about training. So I guess like some of the issues which potentially still exist, which could prevent us from having these lovely open conversations about mental health. So I remember very clearly in my first year of training, so I think it was literally the first couple of weeks, we had some of our lovely counselling psychologists come over to speak to us, and one of the things that they were talking about was personal therapy. So they were discussing all of that, and then they just like very casually, very nonchalantly just like put the question over to us as clinical psychology trainees, like, have you ever experienced personal therapy? And when I say the room went dead, like it was literally like, and I was like having this internal battle in my head. I was like, Miranda, like you literally tell people day in and day out to talk about these things. Like,
Say something!
so in the end, I put my hand up and I was like, yeah, do you know what? I actually have had personal therapy before. And a couple of other people on my cohort said the same. And that's like not throwing any shade on people who didn't feel comfortable to share. I think I'm sharing this experience because it really illustrates how uncomfortable we feel as trainees and maybe how exposed we feel. I actually read a letter which I think put words to some of the concerns that we have as trainees, written by Dr. Khadija Rouf. I've not said her name right and I'm really sorry, but I will link the letter in the description. So basically she talks about how she did disclose experiences of childhood sexual abuse while she was on training, and actually her program team ended up treating her very differently. And like, granted, this was like very many years ago, but actually they scrutinized her a lot more. They kind of intercepted her decision making, so she wasn't able to get the experiences that she wanted on placement, I guess because they imagined that they had a better idea of what she could cope with and what she couldn't cope with. And I think just that letter for me really taps into some of the concerns that we have as trainees, like what does happen if we do share. And I think that's why the guidelines are great, because it really demystifies that process. And one of the things which I think is so important is talking about like that culture of like encouraging sharing and making sure that that feels okay for people. So I was thinking about like what maybe some of the like the obstacles or things to consider around creating this culture are. And one of them which like, I very much stand by the idea that like personal therapy should absolutely be a choice, but I was really struck by just how comfortable the counselling psychologists were when talking about these things. And I think like, I know this varies a lot from course to course, but I think it would definitely be interesting if there was like in some way time built in where you could like opt into that or opt out of that, which is just like either used as like personal development time, so you can like choose to use that like segment for therapy if you'd like it, or just like have some chill time and look after yourself. Because I think that brings me on to like the next tension, which really is like just like the rigor of the program, and there's not really so much that we can do about that, but there's like so much packed into these 3 years in terms of like placement, in terms of teaching, and it's actually very emotionally taxing. Like, I remember we had one Friday which was literally like, morning was self-harm, afternoon was suicide. It was like fantastic. I mean, as overall, it is really like a demanding program. And I know this varies from course to course, but it doesn't feel like there's much time to just like process some of that. And I think like it is difficult because this is not just with the doctorate, but I just think like across like all trainings and things that we do as mental health professionals, that you get like loads of like really aggressively like upsetting and potentially traumatic information, and sometimes like the only step and suggestion that you're given is like,
take time away if this personally affects you.
it's all well and good, but I just think if you're like thinking about across the span of the 3 years, there's potentially like a lot of opportunity for erosion, and it's maybe just thinking about how do we like build more self-care into that. And I suppose finally, again, this is something that like I've got no control over, but there is like a lot of focus on CBT, and I get why, but I think like one of the critiques that I have about CBT and how this maybe doesn't lend itself to like thinking about us as individuals and our mental health is just that like it doesn't have that relational focus at all. And because so much of our teaching is dedicated to CBT, I think it does make me think of like, how are we really going to be able to weave these mental health discussions throughout the course and not make it feel like it's just like this one-off lecture where we just say like,
oh, it's really important.
like if our central model doesn't really encourage us to think of like, okay, like what does this bring up in you and how does that like relate back and forth and all of these other stuff, like say I've experienced when I've done the secondary model that we're taught in, which is PITS, like how are we really gonna have consistent time built in throughout our teaching to reflect on that and kind of make that a more central focus of our discussions? Like, I don't know. These are just tensions. These are just things I'm chewing over. Let me know what you think. Okay, so now finally thinking about being a qualified clinical psychologist, because I think this comes with its own issues. So as much as there are difficulties being a trainee, like I do really recognize like I am super looked after by my uni. Like they really like cushion us and protect us, and there's always people checking in on you. And I think on top of that, as a trainee, it's very much like, you know, you're here to learn, like it's okay to make mistakes, just like figure it out. And I can imagine both of those things really strip away when you're a qualified clinical psychologist and a senior member of staff, like not least because like you're qualified, so therefore you must have all the mental health knowledge you could possibly want. So like,
are you sure you can't figure out your issue on your own?
But I think like, you know, we also cut ties with our university. Most of us go into working with the NHS, and I was reading this other letter by Dr. Annie, who very aptly points out that actually within the NHS sometimes there's this like culture and message of like resilience and powering through and bouncing back, and actually that can feel really at odds with like vulnerability and sharing and opening up when things aren't necessarily going so well. I was also thinking about like, I don't know, I was feeling quite like compassionate and sympathetic towards like my more senior members of staff, because when I was thinking about like, oh, what would make me feel more comfortable in terms of sharing about my mental health, I was like, well, actually, if I could look to people above me and see them sharing, then I'd feel okay to do so. But I think that's always really complicated by the fact that, like, you know, supervisors always have to really clearly hold in mind, like, boundaries and like what's okay to share, what's not okay to share. Like they kind of almost have to be like the pillar of strength and support, so we can like lean on them a little bit. And like, does that then make it difficult for them to lead by example and for them to show us and actually say like, hey, it's okay to talk about these things? And actually, I think there's just always this thing of like, I can lean on my supervisor, but then like, who does my supervisor lean on? Like it all just gets a little bit, I think like the structures for support just feel like a little bit more remote when you're qualified. I think also a point that was like really pertinent and really stood out to me in Dr. Annie's letter is just thinking about like us as psychologists, like especially qualified who, you know, you've got more power and you're a senior member of staff, and I suppose just our capacity to actually do harm and to be the people who are like contributing to the stigmatization and that environment where it feels really difficult to speak up. And that's really hard to think about, because I think we all just want to sit here in like our little angelic ivory towers just thinking like, you know, I don't see any of these issues and I could never partake in these issues. But I think like we're all people with judgments, we're all people with perspectives, and I think especially as clinical psychologists, we're probably going to have a lot of opinions as to like what the correct way or incorrect way is to manage a mental health difficulty. And I think sometimes, like, I'm sure we'd all show a lot of compassion to like service users and people engaging with like therapy from that perspective, but I think sometimes we can maybe be a little bit like harsher and more abrupt with our clinical psychology friends, because we hold them to these certain standards and we expect certain things, and we know certain stuff and we expect them to know certain stuff, and it just can create this like very, very harsh and toxic environment which we just all should very much step away from. But I think ultimately I feel like my point is just that it only gets more complex after qualifying. And I think, you know, we need to be really mindful of just like the organizational level stuff, but also like how we talk to each other and relate to each other as professionals, like up and down the hierarchy or ladder, if you like. Okay, I feel like I have literally just vomited all the thoughts in my brain into video format, so I hope it made sense. I think like my main point with this video is just to like keeping that conversation going, because like I said, guidelines are amazing, but we need to just like keep talking about and keep reflecting on the things that do feel difficult, so we can actually do like some practical, wonderful things to move this discussion forward, so we all get to a place where we can all very comfortably talk about our experiences of mental health difficulties, which can only be a good thing in making us like a more powerful and unified workforce. So it goes without saying that I obviously haven't covered absolutely everything in this video. So if there are considerations which you think are worth mentioning, worth highlighting, please do stick them in the comment section below. You know I love to hear it. But I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you for listening to my brain talk for this video. But yes, I'll wrap it up. I'll leave you to it. Take very good care of yourselves, and I will look forward to speaking to you next week. Ciao for now.